Do you even know what you've done? I blurted out, staring at the tattoo on his arm, my name, Savannah, inked in bold black letters. Harry, my stepdad, didn't even flinch. He just looked at me with that calm, steady gaze of his, the corner of his mouth tugging into a small smile. Yeah, I know exactly what I've done. His confidence made my stomach twist. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some impulsive decision he'd regret later. He meant it. Every single part of it. I didn't even know what to say. My brain screamed at me to walk away, but my feet wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring at him, trying to process how the man who married my mom 4 years ago could do something like this. Why? My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. Why would you do something so insane? Harry leaned back in his chair, rolling his sleeve down like this wasn't the most messed up thing in the world. Because it's the truth, he said simply, like that explained anything. The truth? My words came out in a rush, my chest tightening. You tattooed my name on your arm because of the truth? Do you even hear yourself right now? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up slowly, his tall frame towering over me as he closed the space between us. My pulse raced, and I instinctively stepped back, bumping into the doorframe. You're important to me, Savannah, he said, his voice low and deliberate. More than you realize. I froze. Every instinct told me to shut this down, to say something that would end this conversation for good. But I couldn't. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller with every second that passed. His words hung in the air, suffocating me with their weight. I wasn't just his stepdaughter to him. And that terrified me. I can't do this, I said, finally finding my voice. It came out shaky, but at least it was something. You can't do this. Harry didn't flinch. I already did. I turned and walked out of the room before he could say another word. My hands were shaking as I closed my bedroom door behind me, leaning against it for support. My mind was racing. This wasn't just wrong, it was something I couldn't even begin to understand. But what scared me most? A small, twisted part of me didn't hate it. And that was a secret I couldn't admit to anyone, not even myself. If you think this is where it ends, you're wrong. Because what happens next? It's about to get so much worse. The entire evening, I avoided Harry like my life depended on it. But his gaze, the memory of it, haunted me every second I was alone. It wasn't just the tattoo that unsettled me, it was the way he looked at me, like I was more than just his stepdaughter. And deep down, I knew. This wasn't just a thoughtless gesture. It was deliberate. It meant something. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the coffee machine humming downstairs. Mom had left early for work, and I had planned to spend the day holed up in my room, pretending Harry didn't exist. But the smell of fresh coffee pulled me to the kitchen before I could think twice. When I walked in, there he was, standing by the counter, calmly stirring his mug like nothing had happened. The sleeve of his shirt was rolled up again, and that tattoo, my name, was still there, stark and bold, like a permanent reminder of everything I didn't want to face. "Good morning," he said casually, glancing up at me. I froze for a moment, caught between the doorframe and the sharp edge of reality. His voice was calm, friendly even, but it carried something heavier beneath the surface. "Morning," I mumbled, avoiding his eyes as I reached for a glass. But Harry wasn't the type to let things slide. Not anymore. "Are you going to keep avoiding me all day?" His tone was soft, almost playful, but I could feel the weight of his question. "I'm not avoiding you," I said quickly, too quickly. My hands were shaking as I poured water into the glass. "Come on, Savannah," he said, setting his mug down and leaning against the counter. "You barely said 2 words to me last night. You wouldn't even look at me. What's going on?" I turned to face him, gripping the glass like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. "You know what's going on," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. His eyes softened, but he didn't back down. "If it's about the tattoo." "Of course, it's about the tattoo," I snapped, finally letting the words spill out. "What were you thinking, Harry? Do you have any idea how messed up this is?" For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. And then he said the last thing I expected. "I did it because I care about you." The room felt like it was closing in around me. His words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. You can't say things like that, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You're married to my mom. I know, he said, his tone calm, deliberate. But this has nothing to do with her. This is about us. Us? The word came out like a question, like I couldn't believe he'd actually said it. There is no us, Harry. There can't be. He stepped closer, closing the space between us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I think there already is, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I backed away, needing space, needing air. You need to stop, I said, shaking my head. Whatever this is, it has to stop. Why? His question caught me off guard. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He just looked at me, waiting for an answer. Because it's wrong, I said, my voice trembling. Because it's not okay. Because you're scared, he finished for me. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because he was right. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension and silence. Harry didn't push me any further, but his presence was suffocating. Every time I walked into a room, I felt his eyes on me. Every time I tried to focus on something else, my mind drifted back to his words. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. I needed space, needed to think. So I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But when I opened the door to leave, Harry was standing there, leaning against the doorframe like he'd been waiting for me. Going somewhere, he asked, his tone light, but his eyes serious. Just for a walk, I said, trying to sound casual. I'll come with you, he said, stepping outside before I could protest. The tension between us was unbearable as we walked down the quiet, tree-lined street. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the pavement beneath my feet, but I could feel him watching me. Why are you doing this? I finally asked, breaking the silence. Doing what? This, I said, gesturing between us. The tattoo, the way you're acting. It's not normal, Harry. It's not okay. He stopped walking and turned to face me. Do you really believe that? Yes, I said, but my voice wavered. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto mine. Because I don't. I think this, whatever this is real. And I think you feel it too. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Because he wasn't wrong. I hated myself for it, but there was a part of me, a small, twisted part, that didn't want to run away. That didn't want him to stop. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, turning away from him. Yes, you do, he said, his voice soft but insistent. I kept walking, desperate to put distance between us, but he grabbed my hand, stopping me in my tracks. Look at me, he said, his voice low and steady. I didn't want to. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be able to hide the truth. But I couldn't resist. Slowly, I turned to face him, and the look in his eyes made my heart stop. Tell me I'm wrong, he said. Tell me you don't feel it too. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Because I couldn't lie. Not to him. Not to myself. The air between us felt electric, charged with something I didn't want to name. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. What happened next would change everything. The tension between us was no longer something we could ignore. It hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, growing stronger with every passing day. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I could pretend it wasn't happening. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, when Mom was working her usual night shift, I found myself alone with Harry again. I had curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a book, but I couldn't focus. The words blurred on the page, my mind too consumed with the memory of his gaze, his voice, his tattoo, my name inked on his skin like a claim he was daring the world to challenge. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. They were slow, deliberate, as he walked into the living room and sat down beside me. Too close. Can we talk? He asked softly, his voice breaking through the fragile silence. I didn't look at him. My eyes stayed glued to the book, even though I hadn't read a single word. Not what? I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. You know what, he said. I finally glanced up, and the look in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He knew exactly what he was doing. Harry, don't, I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't back off. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like a spark igniting a fire I couldn't control. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's there, Savannah. You feel it too, don't you?" I pulled my hand away, standing up quickly to put some space between us. "This is wrong," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice cracked. "Wrong," he repeated, standing up and taking a step toward me. "The only thing wrong is that we're hiding from this." I shook my head, backing away as he closed the distance between us. "You're married to my mom," I said, clinging to the one thing that still made sense. "This has nothing to do with her," he said, his tone soft but unwavering. "This is about us." "Us?" I nearly laughed, but the sound came out hollow. "There is no us. You're my stepdad, Harry. Do you even hear yourself?" "I hear myself loud and clear," he said, stepping closer until I could feel the heat of his presence. "And I know you feel it too." I tried to move past him, but he caught my arm, his touch gentle but firm. "Look at me," he said. "I can't," I whispered. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. Slowly, reluctantly, I lifted my eyes to meet his. And in that moment, everything I'd been trying to suppress came rushing to the surface. He let go of my arm, but he didn't move away. His eyes searched mine, looking for something, permission, maybe. "You're making this impossible," I said, my voice barely audible. "Impossible," he repeated. "Or inevitable." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The next day, I tried to act like nothing had happened. But every time I saw Harry, every time our eyes met, I felt that same pull, that same electric charge that left me reeling. By the time evening rolled around, I was a mess of nerves. Mom was working late again, and the thought of being alone with Harry was enough to make my stomach churn. But there was no avoiding it. I was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, when he walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching me. "You're quiet tonight," he said finally. I shrugged, refusing to meet his gaze. "Just tired." "Are you?" he asked, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. I glanced up at him, and the look in his eyes made my heart skip a beat. He wasn't just watching me, he was studying me, like he was trying to figure out what I was thinking. "Stop looking at me like that," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Like what?" he asked, taking a step closer. Like this," I said, gesturing between us. "Like there's something here." He set the glass down and moved closer, his expression soft but intense. "Because there is." "No," I said quickly, standing up. "No, there's not." "Then why are you running?" he asked, his voice calm but relentless. "I'm not running," I said, backing toward the door. "Yes, you are," he said, following me. "And you're scared." "But not of me." "You're scared of what you're feeling." His words hit too close to home, and I froze. He stopped just a few feet away, giving me enough space to breathe but not enough to escape. "You don't have to be scared, Savannah," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "This can't happen, Harry. It can't." "But it already is," he said, taking one final step closer. I didn't know what to do. My mind was screaming at me to push him away, to leave, to do anything but stand there and let this happen. But my body refused to move. The tension between us was unbearable, a storm ready to break. And I knew, deep down, that when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, I woke up determined to create space between Harry and me. I needed to breathe, to think clearly without his constant presence clouding my mind. But Harry wasn't going to make it easy. If anything, he seemed even more determined. Mom was at work, and the house felt eerily quiet. Too quiet. I stayed in my room as long as I could, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, trying to distract myself from the tension that seemed to seep through the walls. But eventually, I had to come out. When I walked into the kitchen, Harry was there, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. His back was to me, but I knew he was aware of my presence. It felt deliberate, like he'd been waiting for me. He turned as I entered, his expression calm but serious. "We need to talk," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He set his cup down and took a step closer. You know what? He said softly. I shook my head, trying to deflect. Harry, there's nothing to talk about. Whatever this is, it needs to stop. That's the problem, he said, his voice steady. It can't stop. I've tried, Savannah. Believe me, I've tried. But I can't keep pretending. Pretending what? I asked, my voice rising in frustration. That I don't feel this way about you, he said, the words falling from his lips like they'd been waiting to escape. That I don't think about you every second of the day. That you don't mean more to me than anyone else ever has. His confession hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for breath. You can't say things like that, I whispered, shaking my head. But it's the truth, he said, stepping closer. And you know it. No, I said, backing away. This is wrong, Harry. You're my stepdad. You're married to my mom. You can't feel this way. But I do, he said, his voice unwavering. And I think you feel it too. Stop, I said, my voice cracking. But he didn't stop. He reached out, his hand brushing against my shoulder, and I froze. His touch was warm, grounding, and it terrified me how much I didn't want to pull away. You don't have to be afraid, he said softly. I'm not afraid, I lied, my heart racing. Yes, you are, he said. You're afraid of what this means. Of what happens if you admit the truth. I wanted to scream, to push him away, to do anything that would break the spell he seemed to have over me. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I avoided Harry as much as I could, but the tension between us was suffocating. Every time I thought about his words, my chest tightened. He wasn't backing down, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending. By the evening, I was exhausted. I retreated to the living room, hoping to lose myself in a movie, but Harry found me there. He sat down on the couch, closer than he needed to be, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. You can't keep running from this, he said finally. I didn't respond, keeping my eyes fixed on the screen. Look at me, he said. I shook my head. No. Why not, he asked, his voice calm but insistent. Because if I do. I trailed off, my voice breaking. Because if you do, you'll have to face the truth, he finished for me. I hated how well he could read me, how easily he seemed to know exactly what I was thinking. This isn't fair, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I know, he said. But it's real. I turned to him then, and the look in his eyes stopped me cold. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He was all in, and he wasn't going to let me pretend anymore. You need to leave me alone, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. You don't mean that, he said. Yes, I do, I insisted, even as my chest tightened with the weight of the lie. He leaned in slightly, his eyes searching mine. Then tell me you don't feel it too. Look me in the eye and tell me this doesn't mean anything to you. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Because I couldn't lie, not about this. That's what I thought, he said softly. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Harry's words replayed in my mind over and over, each one sinking deeper into my chest. He wasn't just pushing boundaries, he was shattering them. And I was letting him. I hated myself for the way my heart raced when he was near, for the way his words lingered in my mind long after he'd spoken them. But most of all, I hated that small, twisted part of me that didn't want him to stop. The sound of soft footsteps pulled me from my thoughts, and my heart leapt into my throat. I knew it was him before I even heard the knock on my door. Savannah? His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I didn't respond, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But he didn't. Please, he said. I just need to talk to you. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the blanket. Every part of me screamed to stay where I was, to ignore him, to pretend this wasn't happening. But I couldn't. I got up slowly and opened the door, my breath catching when I saw him standing there. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice trembling. Then let's stop pretending, he said, stepping closer. His words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The line had already been crossed. Now it was only a matter of how far we'd go. That night, everything felt heavier. The silence between us was almost unbearable, yet I couldn't bring myself to leave the room. Mom was supposed to be home late, and the emptiness of the house amplified every thought in my head. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to focus on my phone, when Harry walked in. His footsteps were deliberate, his presence impossible to ignore. He sat down beside me, closer than he ever had before, and the air felt electric. "We need to stop pretending," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but full of weight, as if he'd been rehearsing this moment. "Harry, don't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But he leaned closer, his gaze locking onto mine. "You can say whatever you want, Savannah, but I know the truth. I know you feel it too." My heart raced. I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, but no words came out. His hand brushed against mine, and I froze. "Stop," I managed to say, though it sounded more like a plea than a command. "I can't," he said, his voice dropping lower. "And neither can you." His words hit like a tidal wave, washing away the last remnants of resistance I'd been clinging to. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, everything shifted. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, and suddenly the weight of the past few weeks exploded into something I couldn't control. My hands trembled, but I didn't pull away. We both knew this was wrong, forbidden, and yet nothing else mattered in that moment. The world blurred, reduced to just us, and the line we'd sworn never to cross shattered beneath the weight of everything we'd been holding back. When it was over, the silence returned, but it felt different now, thick, oppressive. I sat there, staring at the floor, my thoughts spinning out of control. What had we done? How could we come back from this? Harry's voice broke through my haze. "Savannah, it's going to be okay," he said softly, like his words could undo the irreversible. But before I could respond, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of keys turning in the lock. My blood ran cold. "Nan." The door swung open, and there she was, standing in the entryway with her purse still slung over her shoulder. Her eyes landed on us, and I saw the realization dawn on her face in an instant. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. The look in her eyes, shock, betrayal, pain, was louder than any scream. "Mom, I started, but my voice cracked, and the words died in my throat." Her gaze shifted to Harry, her lips trembling as she struggled to speak. What's going on?" Neither of us answered. The silence stretched, suffocating, until she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't believe this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "In my own house. With my own daughter." Her words hit me like a slap, and the reality of what we'd done came crashing down. There was no excuse, no justification. We'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her, and the sound echoed through the house like a final nail in the coffin of everything I'd ever known. I sat there in the aftermath, numb and unable to move. Harry reached for me, but I pulled away, my body trembling with a mix of shame and regret. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice full of conviction. But it was. It had to be. Because some mistakes can never be undone.